If you've hit 50 and noticed that your shape has changed because you've started putting on weight in your midsection, the so-called meno belly, then you're not alone. When we go through the menopause, we start to accumulate that deep belly fat called visceral fat. Now, my subscribers have asked for a video about it, so I'm making a two-parter. In this video, we'll discuss what visceral fat is and why it matters, and in the next video, what you can do about it. So let's get going. And first, what is visceral fat? Well, fat is stored in the body in the form of adipose tissue. That's a mixture of fat storage cells called adipocytes and connective tissue. And the function of fat is that it's an energy store, so a fuel store, and it's also there for insulation. So body fat is completely normal and we all have it. Now, the fat that we can see and grab hold of, well, that's called subcutaneous fat. So sub meaning under, cutaneous meaning skin. But we do have other fat that you can't see, and the umbrella term is ectopic fat. And this includes fat that's within our muscles and our organs. And the fat that we have deep in our abdominal cavity surrounding our organs and our bowel, well, that's called visceral fat. Now, I want to be clear here, it's completely normal to have some fat in your abdominal cavity. I know this because I spent the last 20 years of my life as a radiologist looking at the scans of people's innards, and I've seen it. Now, this is a CT scan of someone's abdomen. Imagine you are standing at their feet looking up at a slice through their upper abdomen. I've marked the liver on the right as you look from the feet, and the left kidney and some colon, but I want to focus on the fat, and fat on CT is a very dark grey. Now, I've zoomed in on this image and marked the patient's skin and the fat underneath it, which is the subcutaneous fat. The next layer down is a lighter grey. That's the muscles of the abdomen wall. It's not just there to give you a six-pack, it holds all our squishy bits in. Underneath that, we have more fat surrounding the organs and bowel, and that's the visceral fat. So imagine the muscles of the abdomen wall as a continuous ring. The fat on the outside of that ring is the subcutaneous fat, and the fat on the inside of the ring is the visceral fat. And this diagram shows how people the same size can have different amounts of visceral fat. Person A has most of their fat under the skin, so outside the ring of the abdominal wall muscles. Person B has most of their fat inside the ring, so more visceral fat. And this explains how someone can have their body weight in the normal range and still have a large amount of visceral fat. I've seen it referred to on social media as skinny fat or thin on the outside, fat on the inside, but the medical term is normal weight obesity. And it's one of the reasons we've moved away from using body mass index towards using waist to height ratio, because it's a better representation of how much abdominal fat we have. And I'll put a link to the NHS waist to height ratio calculator in the description box. Now, I'm briefly just going to discuss my metrics, so skip forward 30 seconds if you're not interested in that. Now, my waist measures around 76 centimetres, so that's just over 30 inches, and I'm 5'11" tall, or 178 centimetres, and that gives me a waist to height ratio of 0.43. Now, anything over 0.5 is considered increased risk, and anything over 0.6 higher risk. But risk of what? Well, visceral fat is associated with a higher rate of chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure and coronary artery disease. And this is because it secretes pro-inflammatory chemicals called adipokines. And these, amongst other things, contribute to the development of insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is where the cells in the body stop responding to the hormone insulin as they should, so they stop taking glucose out of the bloodstream as efficiently. But visceral fat can also infiltrate into the tissue of the pancreas and so directly influence the cells that produce the insulin as well. So the more visceral fat we accumulate, the higher our risk of chronic disease. So we've discussed visceral fat and why we need to pay attention to it. So now let's consider what happens in midlife women. So when we go through the perimenopause and the menopause, our estrogen levels first fluctuate and then they drop and they stay low. So not zero, but low. And this is important because estrogen helps determine where we store fat. So in the pre-menopause, we tend to preferentially store it around our bum and our thighs, the so-called pear-shaped. And once we go through the menopause, we become more apple-shaped. So we start to accumulate fat in our midsection, and that includes visceral fat. So if we can't see it, how do we know it's there, and what determines how much we have? Well, measurement is difficult because it lies deep within our abdomen. You know, from looking at us, it's hard to separate subcutaneous and visceral fat, as I showed in the diagram with the circles. Now, waist circumference, that does give us a guide, as we've already discussed, and it's why waist circumference is one of the measurements we use when we're determining whether someone has metabolic syndrome or not. And for the purposes of diagnosing metabolic syndrome, an increased waist circumference is taken as anything over 88 centimetres or 35 inches in women and 102 centimetres or 40 inches in men. Now, the threshold is lower at 80 centimetres and 90 centimetres respectively for some ethnic groups, including South Asians, because of the higher risk of having a large amount of visceral fat at a lower body mass. However, for the purposes of research, we do need an imaging test like an MRI to be really accurate. And as for what determines how much we have, well, that's a really interesting question. And the answer may well lie in something called the personal fat threshold theory. And that was developed by Professor Roy Taylor here in the UK at Newcastle University. And the theory states that we all have a personal threshold, which may be genetically inherited in part, to how much fat we can store underneath the skin. So remember, that's the subcutaneous fat. So if we gain weight, we start to fill up our subcutaneous space. And when a threshold is reached and you can't fit any more in, we start to store it internally, so as ectopic or visceral fat. And this threshold is different for everyone. So some people can store only a small amount of fat under the skin and some can store lots. And this can help explain things. So how somebody with a body mass index of 40 can have normal metabolism and no chronic diseases, presumably because they've got a large capacity for storing fat under the skin where it's not causing any problems. And conversely, someone with a body mass index of 25 could have a low threshold, so they don't store so much under the skin, so it starts accumulating internally where it starts causing trouble. And this is really interesting because the traditional teaching says that type 2 diabetes is associated with being overweight, but the personal fat threshold theory says not necessarily. And it quotes a statistic that 1 in 6 newly diagnosed type 2 diabetics have a body mass index of 27 or below. And for yes, all the faults of body mass index, I'm using it in this context because it's still used in research. Now, in a really interesting experiment called the Retune study, Professor Taylor's group took 20 people with a body mass index of 27 or below and type 2 diabetes, and they got them to lose weight and compared them to a control group of 20 people without diabetes. Now, weight loss was achieved by using a very low calorie diet, so some shakes of around 600 calories and then 200 calories worth of non-starchy vegetables. And they did this for 2 to 4 weeks and then followed a maintenance diet which followed the principles of the Mediterranean diet. More of that in video 2. And before I go on, it's just important to say that a very low calorie diet like this, well, it should only be done under the supervision of a dietitian. It's not something we should be doing ourselves because of the risk of micronutrient deficiencies. Now, they carried out this dieting cycle several times and they measured visceral fat on MRI before and after. And over the course of the year, the study group lost on average 6.5% of their initial body weight and 70% put their type 2 diabetes into remission. And they lost both visceral and liver fat. Now, this is interesting because it shows that with a near normal BMI, you can still put your type 2 diabetes into remission if you lose weight. And this supports the personal fat threshold theory. There was less weight loss required to reverse the type 2 diabetes, so around 5 to 7%, than is typically seen in people with a higher body mass index, where it takes about 10% from trial data. Now, the obvious limitation of this study was the relatively small numbers, and it also has to be noted that the population was predominantly white European. So although there are other reasons you can develop type 2 diabetes, the personal fat threshold theory is pretty convincing. So to conclude, we can't easily see visceral fat, but it does matter. It's influenced by our hormones, probably our genetics as well, and it has a significant impact on our long-term health. But here's the good news, it can be reversed. And in the next video, I'll show you how, based on evidence, not hype. And if you found this video useful, I'd love it if you would consider liking or subscribing. It helps me to grow my channel. And I'll leave a video here on how to stop evening snacking, a really common habit that contributes to weight gain in midlife, and I'll see you there.